I'm Wendy Jensen. I'm one of the authors of the New World Veterinary Repertory.
And I'm Richard Pitcairn. I'm the other author of the Repertory. Both have been in veterinary practice exclusively, that form of medicine for, well, for me, about 40 years. How about for you, Wendy?
Let's see, I guess I started in '94.
Wow, okay.
The first easy question, that comes to my mind is, what are the sources for the New World Veterinary Repertory?
Well, the main book behind our repertory is Boger's Bonninghausen Repertory, and we use that as the base. And once we started with that book, then we went to Kent because he's got a lot of rubrics that aren't in Bonninghausen. We also looked through Jar's new manual of the homeopathic materia medica. That was a really good one. Again, some unique rubrics in there. And then finally, we added in some from Boger's Synoptic Key. So those are the four main ones. We did, in addition to using those as the main sources, we looked at some additions from Knerr's, K-N-E-R-R, his repertory, as well as Boraki. And then we went to Submateria Medica and added our own rubrics based on what the remedies look like in the Materia Medica. So we looked at Herring's Guiding Symptoms. We looked at T.F. Allen's Handbook, Hughes' Cyclopedia, H.C. Allen's The Nosodes, so we could have some nosodes in there.
Oh, wow, okay.
Ann Schutz's New and Old Forgotten Remedies. And then we didn't leave out, of course, Hahnemann's Materia Medica Pura in chronic diseases. And then finally, we wanted, because in veterinary medicine we deal with wounds a lot, we used a Schwartz's wound repertory to put in a lot of rubrics from that. So it's got a lot of material in it.
We also added in, there's a repertory that my colleague Joy Dunn, who was working for me back in the late 80s, put together as a research project a cancer repertory based on our study of these same sources that she's talking about. And so we included that as well.
Fantastic. As I'm guessing, in general, cancer in animals is really an increasing thing.
Oh, yes. They're saying now the veterinary profession is predicting some breeds of dogs, half of them will have cancer in their lives.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
No, we didn't use a therapeutic. We used the Boger edition of the Bonninghausen Repertory. And the reason for that was that Boger was I think he was very sharp. He really understood Bonninghausen's work. And what he did was a wonderful compilation of all of Bonninghausen's material into one repertory and made it much more accessible. And so I had found from my experience that repertory was the most useful one for my veterinary work. I would say, wouldn't you say, Wendy, I'm just guessing, 90% or more of it is from that repertory?
Oh, yes, that's a good figure.
To really use it in a skillful way, you do have to understand that repertory and how it was put together, the philosophy behind it. You have to understand Bonninghausen's work, basically. I had the idea, Marco, of a veterinary repertory for quite a long time. I could see the usefulness of it. It's not that the Bonninghausen repertory and the Kent repertory were not sufficient. It's just for veterinarians, there's a lot of material we can't use in those repertories. So it takes time skimming through it, trying to find the rubrics we want to find, and also flipping back and forth between Kent. This is what I did anyway. I'd flip back and forth between Kent and Bonninghausen to work my case. So I could see the value of having a repertory focus for that work. And so I had, I should say, started that project several times, and then it didn't complete. I was busy myself with many things. And then when I would try to find somebody to work with me on it, for one reason or another, it didn't go forward until I encountered Wendy, and Wendy was willing and dedicated, and so she actually got into the position of working on it and stimulating me to continue.
Fantastic.
You really have to have your passion to keep you going, because when you're looking at the 300th rubric for the day and the 18,000th remedy to put in there, it does get tiring.
And there's a lot of background work in this as well as our experience in our study. But like, for example, I had learned on my Mac computer, I had learned how to do some programming. And so I put together a little program where I could select a rubric from Kent and a rubric from Boninghausen, and the program would then combine the two for me.
Fantastic.
And then we could export that into our repertory. So that was really handy, but it just gives you an idea of what we had to do.
How much stuff, Yeah.
And then, of course, Wendy's husband has done a lot of work for us, also editing. So it does a lot of back work.
The first thing that we had to do in order to get it ready into the form it is now was to eliminate all the symptoms that we can't really see in animals that aren't speaking your language, any non-human animals. It could also apply to, say, some human patients perhaps who are comatose or even infants, just as an aside. But so first we took those symptoms out. They'd be like, because the physiology is different, so it'd be a symptom we're not seeing in our veterinary practices, or it might be, say, dreams or sensations, things that we just can't know about our animals. So why have to go through all those rubrics if we don't need them? Then we'd add in others that also apply to the animals from the other sources. We thought, there's certain even body parts that people don't have, anal glands, for example, and so we found some things that seem to refer to that and put that in there.
A few people have them.
And one thing that we did do when you're thinking about how Kent does aggravations, he often does particular aggravations, whereas Boninghausen did some general aggravation, general modalities. So we made sure to put all the Kentian modalities where they belong in the particular section. People wondering how we could mix Kent and Boninghausen. Well, that's how we did it. We kept Kent the way he meant it to be, and then the Boninghausen modalities were in the general. The language, for example, you didn't want arms and legs. Instead you had posterior extremities and anterior extremities, so that we know, what you mean by an arm or a hand or a finger or a hock or a stifle instead. So we had to change the terminology. And then the one last thing was menses is considered equivalent to estrus in animals. It's not the same period during the reproductive cycle, but it's a discharge. And the discharge is very important during the health of the patient. So that menses equals estrus in the New World.
How is the repertory organized? What should a veterinary expect when they open it up? How is it structured?
Well, the repertory is the one that the Boger edited. The printed book is much like Kent's in terms of anatomical sections. However, the order is a little bit different. For example, generalities, he puts it as sensations and complaints. It's kind of in the middle of the book. So the book form that we did, and as it will be on the computer application, we moved it to be like Kent's. So generalities is at the back, so it'll be familiar to people. So it's pretty much organized the same way. There are some differences in the sense of the way, for example, what comes to mind is that if you look in Kent's, it has something to do with bowel movements, you'll find the rectum section will have all about the functions of the rectum, it'll have constipation and diarrhea and so on there, whereas Boger's edition of the Boninghausen puts those rubrics under the stool. So there are some differences like that, but we kept the same. I don't think we felt like we should really change that order because that's the way Boger had organized it. So anyway, there are some differences like that you have to get familiar with. I would say the primary thing is following Boninghausen's practice and experience, and that is that Boninghausen in his writings tells us that one of his discoveries was that in studying provings and patients, he found that when there was a modality, for example, worse from movement or worse from temperature or whatever, that he found that that modality would apply to many symptoms the patient had, and that sometimes they weren't quite aware of it or hadn't paid attention to it. But that was an important discovery on his part. He also applied that to concomitants. So when he organized his information, then he, in a sense, more generalized the modalities and concomitants. And we retained that format because that's what's so very useful to our veterinarians. In other words, you may be presented with an animal, say it has a modality like worse for movement, but we can't tell as clearly as it would be in a human being what that modality refers to, you see. So the advantage of the Bonninghausen approach is that he set those modalities in a section off to apply to the whole section. For example, if you go into one of the anatomical sections, that not all of them have this, most of them do though, where they'll have aggravations and ameliorations and concomitants set aside as their own section within that part. So for example, if you're into the fever section and say it's worse from some modality, that modality applies to every rubric in that section. So that's the method of the Boger-Bonninghausen. Well, it's very useful for veterinarians because, again, our limitation of not being able to define as clearly what the modality refers to. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Yeah, it's really the Bonninghausen method. But we're using it as, it's very useful for veterinarians because of our particular informational limitations.
You mentioned, you're teaching. You still teach actively these days, right?
I'm doing less than I did. This program for veterinarians that we started, the first one was finished in 1992. And it's a year-long program for veterinarians. We meet 5 times in the year for 4-day meetings where they're trained in homeopathy. And then in between, they have assignments and casework, and we have an online forum to help them with their learning and so on.
Great.
So that course is still going. A few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I turned it over to another person as a director. I'm heading out next week to teach in it.
Ah, great.
But I'm one of the teachers now. I'm not the director.
Ah, okay,
And,
yeah.
I still do an annual meeting every March for the veterinarians that have taken training with us.
Okay, great. So
less than I did.
And I've been hearing a lot about people talking about the cross-references in your repertory.
Well, that's I think it's my favorite part of the repertory because I used to, especially when you use more than one repertory, but even within the same one, you'll find, especially Boger-Bonninghausen, it's actually a compilation itself from before we got it. Boger made it a compilation. So you'll find a rubric in one place that isn't quite perfect for what you need, but if with our cross-references we've linked it as we're going through and making this repertory, we're thinking, oh, wait a minute, that's really similar to this rubric. So we made a cross-reference so you can go find it, and then you might say, yes, that's much better. That's what I want. And the remedies aren't necessarily the same, even though the wording is very similar, like the difference between a rubric calling something dark versus another rubric calling something black. You know, they can be very similar. It depends on what you see, what the lighting is that day. Or another example is you might find your patient goes with physical exertion. And so we cross-reference ascending stairs aggravate. You know, that kind of physical exertion could certainly fit. But again, the remedies were different. And we thought, well, we could just put those two together, but we weren't sure. You know, sometimes the remedies really fit one or the other, and we didn't want to mess with what the original masters had said. So the answer was to do a cross-reference, and then you could find what you needed. And that way, you know, it really improved our accuracy using those cross-references. So we're very happy with those.
Marco, let me add in, it's important, I think, for people to understand, is in the computer form of the repertory, the great ease of use, because Wendy's talking about moving to another rubric, you can do it by simply clicking on it.
Yeah.
You don't have to go find it. You click it, it takes you right to it, and then a lot of the times when you go there, all right, Wendy, when you get to the other one, you can go back to the first one if you want.
You can just click right back. That's right.
Yeah. So it makes it very, very fast and usable.
I wanted to bring up one other thing that I forgot to mention when we talked about the organization of the repertory. It only has an extremity section that's just general. And so what we did was we put that section, those rubrics, in the posterior extremities. So if you ever work looking for something that you think should be a general, look in the posterior section in the New World.
There hasn't been a large volume of feedback that I have received. I've seen some very positive things. I've seen occasional criticisms that usually have to do with them not knowing how to find their way around it. Like we're talking about,
right.
Not being familiar with the Bogenhausen layout. That does have to be understood, as we talked about. So I would say generally positive. I find that going to some meetings and so on, though, I find that many veterinarians, like I talked about earlier, the historical use of homeopathy by veterinarians, that many veterinarians that I meet don't use repertories. So there's going to be a smaller group, but those that are using it seem to be very favorably inclined towards it.
The repertory really is just to lead you there to the Materia Medica. It's really supposed to just be an index.
And even if a veterinarian doesn't have the inclination to use a repertory very much, it's useful as a tool in the sense that, say they want to learn, say they work with a particular type of animal, an emergencies, dairy cattle or something, and they're dealing with a particular problem, they can find a rubric that applies. Now they know the group of remedies to study in Materia Medica. That's very helpful.
What has been so far your experience of using the repertory in your cases?
Oh, it's been a great relief. And imagine just having to wade through all the rubrics that you don't need. It kind of makes you a little bit blinkered, so you might miss the one you actually need. Whereas now every single one can apply to our patient. So that's been a big relief for me. It's helped me dial into the center of the case much quicker. And so I've been really happy using it.
Maybe, Marco, I just had the thought, at some point in the future, maybe we should do another little webinar that just shows people how to use it in a more practical way. Like, here's how it's laid out, here's how we analyze a case.
And of course, remember, there's the professional course in veterinary homeopathy for any vets that want further training.
Yeah.
And that's the website, PIVH.
Fantastic.
Yeah, PIV. They named, after I turned it over to the new person, they insisted on changing the name to the Pitcairn Institute. I was embarrassed by that,
right.
But it makes sense because that's what people know. So, it's
Makes
Pitcairn
sense.
Institute of Veterinary Homeopathy, PIV. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, guys, thank you so much for this short introduction. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope our listeners will like it too. And we very much look forward to the next one to go more in depth into this amazing repertory.
All right. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco.